I've reviewed new data from the Department of Energy and NERC, and blackouts are no longer rare. Demand is rising, old plants are closing, and extreme weather is pushing the grid to its limits. Experts warn that without 24/7 backup power, some regions could see up to 100 times more blackout hours by 2030. So today, we're breaking down the 10 states most at risk in 2026, why they're vulnerable, and how to prepare before it's too late. Stay to the end. I'll share a quick blackout survival checklist that every household should have ready. 1. Texas, America's power giant with a fragile core. When you talk about blackouts in America, you have to start with Texas. The 2021 winter freeze, remember that? Left over 4.5 million homes and businesses in the dark. More than 200 people died, many from hypothermia. It wasn't just a freak storm, it was a system failure. The Electric Reliability Council of Texas, ERCOT, runs its own grid, separate from the rest of the U.S., and that independence has become both a point of pride and a dangerous weak spot. Fast forward to 2025, and Texas energy demand has exploded. According to ERCOT's 2024 Seasonal Reliability Assessment, power use hit record highs last summer, over 85,000 megawatts during heat waves, driven by population growth, air conditioning, and a surge in new data centers powering AI and crypto. That's a 10% jump in just 2 years. And here's the kicker. While demand is surging, a large chunk of the state's natural gas and wind generation remains weather sensitive. So what happens when a cold front or heat dome stretches across the state again? If fuel deliveries stall, pipelines freeze, or generation capacity drops at the wrong moment, the grid could buckle again. ERCOT has made upgrades, but experts from the U.S. Department of Energy still warn that Texas remains among the most at-risk states for extreme weather-driven outages. Texans are resilient, no doubt about that. But resilience doesn't keep the lights on when temperatures plunge. And as the nation's largest energy producer, what happens in Texas doesn't stay in Texas. It ripples through the entire country. But Texas isn't alone. Other states are quietly standing on the same edge. 3. Florida, heat, hurricanes, and hidden grid. Stress Florida is a high-stakes state when it comes to blackout risk. And it's not just the hurricanes you see coming. Behind the scenes, there's a cocktail of stressors: extreme heat demand, salt damage, flooding, aging infrastructure, and severe storm damage. Let me paint you a picture. In 2024, Hurricane Milton knocked out power to over 2.2 million customers across Florida. That's a striking reminder. When a major storm slams into the Gulf Coast, the grid takes a brutal hit. Florida Power and Light had to scramble, restoring much of their outages in days. But even with aggressive repair, the damage reveals how vulnerable the system is. Now add to that the everyday heat challenge. In Florida, air conditioning isn't a luxury, it's life support. When temperatures soar, demand for AC skyrockets. But here's the problem. Solar panels produce less during late afternoons into evening, exactly when the heat burden is highest. When that gap between supply and demand widens, the grid must lean on backup plants, which often run low on margin, fuel, or flexibility. Then there's the constant threat of infrastructure stress. Salt air corrodes equipment, flooding knocks out substations, and repeated storms force utilities to route power lines through volatile zones. Utilities are trying to keep up. For example, TECO in Tampa has buried about half its lines, upgraded poles, and strengthened systems, efforts which reportedly cut outages by 23% and shortened durations by 32%. But even that may not be enough when the next monster hurricane or heat dome strikes. One more piece you might not see. Studies show that during compound weather events, like heavy rain plus wind plus heat, outage severity and duration tend to spike. That means Florida's risk isn't just isolated storms. It's when several extremes collide. So when you live in Florida, it's not a question of if you'll see a blackout. It's when and how bad. Up next, states where even mild weather could push things over the edge. 4. New York. Crowded risks, hidden strain. New York's power story is becoming more fragile by the day. The state's grid operator, NYISO, has now formally warned that reliability shortfalls could emerge as early as 2026, especially in New York City and Long Island. Here's what we're seeing. Demand is rising, thanks to electrification, denser population growth, data centers, and higher consumption per household. At the same time, several peaker plants, those extra generators fired during peak load times, are being retired or constrained by emissions rules. In New York City and Long Island, NYISO's short-term reliability reports show that under high-demand conditions, margins will become dangerously thin, especially when unexpected generator outages or transmission constraints kick in. Think about your apartment building or office tower. When one block loses power, cascading failures, overloaded circuits, backup systems maxed, transformers overheating, can drag down neighboring areas fast. Big outages in a dense urban grid don't stay local. You flick one switch, the chain reaction begins. Also, New York's transmission system is under stress. Some planned lines and energy imports, like the Champlain-Hudson Power Express, have been delayed or scaled back, which limits how much power can be delivered into the heart of NYC during peak stress times. And don't forget aging infrastructure. Many generation units have been in service for decades and are being pushed harder than ever. NYISO's reports flag that as these units degrade, the chance of sudden failures increases, just when the grid needs them most. So yes, New York has safeguards, plans, and forecasts. But the reality is, the window of margin is narrowing, and in high-stakes conditions, that could turn into rolling blackouts in the city and beyond. Up next, we'll head into the heartland, states you might assume are safer, but are quietly showing red flags. 5. Illinois Midwest Corridor, including Michigan, Indiana, Ohio. If you picture the Midwest as safe because it's not coastal, think again. This corridor is quietly one of the country's pressure points for blackouts. MISO, the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator that covers much of this region, warned in 2024 that its system faces immediate and serious challenges as retirements of thermal plants outpace new firm resources. In short, supply margins are tightening while demand keeps rising. Add to that PJM's record winter peaks, and you've got a recipe where extreme weather plus equipment failures can quickly overwhelm local capacity. Michigan, Indiana, Ohio, and Illinois carry heavy industrial loads and dense population centers that need reliable power for factories, hospitals, and high-rise buildings. When those loads spike in a deep freeze, the grid has less cushion to ride it out. Several studies and state reports flag the Great Lakes Corridor as a vulnerability hotspot, especially where aging transmission and generation assets are being pushed beyond their normal lifetimes. Here's a human angle. In Michigan, recent analyses show the state ranking poorly on outage duration and restoration time compared with peers. That means when outages happen, residents can be off power longer than Americans in many other states. Imagine a winter night, furnaces straining, hospitals running on backup, roads iced over, and substations or long-distance transmission lines failing because they're old or because a single generator trips. That cascade effect is exactly what grid operators keep warning about. The region's transition to renewables helps long-term resilience, but also creates short-term stress as large, dispatchable plants retire faster than firm replacements arrive. Grid operators are trying fixes, but the window when shortages could occur is real. Up next, New England's quiet risk when gas supply and cold collide 6. Massachusetts and New England. Now let's head to New England, one of the most energy-constrained regions in the entire country. If you've ever lived through a Massachusetts winter, you know how brutal it can get. When those Arctic fronts push down from Canada, temperatures can plunge below zero for days. And that's when the real problem begins. Because New England's grid depends heavily on natural gas for both heating and electricity generation. Here's the catch. Most of that gas has to travel through a limited number of interstate pipelines, many of which are already running near full capacity in winter. According to ISO New England, during extreme cold snaps, heating demand skyrockets, and power plants sometimes can't get enough gas to keep running. When that happens, operators are forced to rely on oil-fired plants or even imported liquefied natural gas from overseas. Expensive, dirty, and unreliable options. In 2023, ISO NE publicly warned that a severe, prolonged cold spell could bring the grid dangerously close to fuel shortages and rolling blackouts. During the Christmas Eve cold wave that year, system operators reported that regional electricity demand peaked at over 20,000 megawatts, near the grid's upper limit. The Department of Energy later noted that the region's energy infrastructure remains at high risk of disruption from both weather and supply constraints. It's not just theory. We've seen it happen. During the 2018 bomb cyclone, fuel supply issues nearly caused widespread outages. That same pattern still exists today, and while renewable energy is expanding, offshore wind, solar, it's not yet reliable enough to handle multi-day winter storms. Imagine this: a blizzard knocks out power lines, snow buries roads, and backup fuel tanks start running dry. In some New England towns, even a few hours without power in sub-zero weather can become life-threatening. Families rely on space heaters, wood stoves, or car batteries just to stay warm. And as grid operators warn that capacity shortfalls could begin as early as 2026, it's clear New England is walking a tightrope between progress and vulnerability. But if you think coastal risk ends here, wait until you see what's happening down south in Louisiana. 8. Washington, Oregon. Renewable power under pressure. When you think of the Pacific Northwest, images of rains, forests, clean rivers, and hydro dams probably come to mind. And that's not wrong. Washington and Oregon rely heavily on hydropower, along with wind and solar, to meet much of their electricity needs. In fact, hydropower contributes about 50% of the region's annual energy generation and provides significant flexible capacity to balance variable renewables. But beneath that green optimism, there's a growing fragility. When snowpack is low, reservoirs are constrained, or drought grips the region, hydropower output suffers. And with climate change, snowpack volatility is becoming more extreme. Transmission constraints make things worse. Moving power from generation sites into population centers means long lines, potential failure points, and limited redundancy. Here's a real danger scenario. Imagine summer heat pushing electricity demand high in Portland and Seattle, wind farms underperforming during a lull, and hydropower restricted because reservoir levels have dropped. In that moment, the grid must rely on imports from nearby states. But when neighbors are stressed, say California or Idaho during their own heat waves, those imports can vanish or get throttled. The interconnects that once felt like backup become weak links. In Oregon, some grid models indicate that the probability of unserved load has already risen. PacifiCorp has suggested that wind, solar, and battery additions aren't sufficient to cover the declining hydropower and retiring thermal plants. Utilities are starting to talk publicly about more aggressive storage, contracts, and power purchase agreements to shore things up, but those take years to build and integrate. So, yep, while the Northwest is a poster child for clean energy, it's not invincible. In extreme, perfect storm conditions, drought, heat, low wind, stressed neighbors, blackouts could ripple through states that least expect it. Up next, heads down to the southeast, where growth and heat threaten already burdened grids. 9. Georgia, southeast, underestimated but under pressure. Don't let the warm weather fool you. Georgia and the southeast are quietly building stress into their electric grids. Rapid population growth and booming development are pushing energy demand upward. According to Georgia Power, the state's non-nuclear generation assets had an outage rate of 1.49% last year, among the better figures in the industry. But that doesn't tell the full story of strain under extremes. Here's a snapshot. In June 2025, a brutal heat wave triggered emergency actions from the Department of Energy to protect the southeast grid from collapse. The DOE issued orders authorizing power plants to run at full capacity, an alarming sign that the region skirts danger when temperatures spike. Now, add storm damage, flooding, and salt corrosion to the mix. Hurricanes and tropical systems frequently batter coastal Georgia and the southeast. Power lines get knocked down, substations get flooded, and infrastructure degrades faster in humid salt air. When storms hit just before or during extreme heat, the grid is already at a precarious point. Another vulnerability: during cold snaps, the region still leans on natural gas pipelines that may become constrained. When gas can't flow, backup generators struggle. And it's not only Georgia. The Southeast is part of the SERC Regional Reliability Area, meaning it shares electricity flows with neighboring states. When one state is under stress, that sharing can backfire, pulling down reliability across the region. One local alert: experts predicted Georgia would rank third worst in blackout risk in summer 2024, tallying over 91 hours of cumulative outage across multiple events. That's a warning flag. So, while much of the focus lands on storms or cold zones, don't forget, the Southeast plays a dangerous balancing act. Growth, heat, Storms, shared grids, they all point to a region where blackouts may arrive, not with a roar, but through failure under silent pressure. Next, we hit the inland west. Desert heat meets sparse grid options. 10. Nevada, inland west. Isolation. Has a price. At first glance, Nevada and much of the inland west might seem safer. Wide open land, smaller populations, and plenty of sunshine for solar power. But that's exactly what makes them fragile when the grid comes under stress. According to the U.S. Energy Information Administration, more than 23% of Nevada's electricity now comes from solar, one of the highest shares in the nation. That's great on sunny days, but once the sun drops or monsoon clouds roll in, backup systems are pushed to their limits. Nevada's grid is heavily interconnected with California and the broader Western interconnection, meaning it relies on power imports when demand spikes. But here's the catch. If California or Arizona falters during a heat wave, those same transmission lines become bottlenecks. The North American Electric Reliability Corporation warned in its 2024 Summer Reliability Assessment that the western U.S. faces an elevated risk of power shortfalls during extreme heat, especially when solar output drops and imports are limited. And then there's geography. Long stretches of desert transmission lines run through some of the harshest terrain in the country. Extreme temperatures, lightning strikes, dust storms, each one of those factors can trigger outages or equipment failure. During last year's record-breaking heat dome, parts of southern Nevada and Utah saw transformers overheating and localized blackouts lasting up to 8 hours as utility crews raced to prevent wildfires. Even though Las Vegas and Reno get most of the attention, the real concern is rural Nevada. Vast distances between substations make repairs slow. FEMA has repeatedly flagged the inland west as a delay zone for power restoration after major events, meaning that small towns could stay dark long after urban centers recover. So while cities like Las Vegas keep their lights blazing with casino-level redundancy, the rest of the state and much of the inland west sit on the edge of vulnerability. One lightning strike, one failed import, or one prolonged heat wave away from cascading blackouts. So, which of these 10 states are you living in? Because next year's blackout map could look a whole lot different. Don't wait for the lights to go out. Subscribe to Frugal Prepping and turn on the bell, because in the next few minutes, you'll learn how to protect your home, your food, and your family without spending a fortune. Stay prepared, stay smart, and stay one step ahead.